and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. This is a series of comedy podcasts all about Scotland's history by me, Daniel Downey. I am a professional comedian based in Edinburgh. I'm also a historian. I've got a master's degree in Scottish history. And we're back, baby. This is episode 1 of 6 brand new episodes of the podcast I've spent the last 6-7 months writing. I'm very, very proud of these new episodes, and I really hope that you enjoy the latest series of the podcast. And today, we're just going to pick up right where we left off at the end of the previous series, and we're going to talk about the Williamite intervention in British and Irish politics in 1688 and 1689, the so-called Glorious Revolution. Today's episode is all about the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689. Now, the term Glorious Revolution is one that would be coined by Whig historians in the revolution's aftermath on account of its apparent bloodlessness. Although, as we'll see over the course of the next few episodes of the podcast, the revolution would prove to be anything but bloodless in Scotland and Ireland. Here, the revolution would have a profound impact on society, culture, and the gable ends of houses in Ireland and Scotland for centuries to come. William, he had arrived in England in November 1688, and James, despite having an army of 25,000, was unable to halt his son-in-law's progress across the country, as most of his army, along with members of his own family, defected to William's cause. And they defected to William's cause out of desperation. They turned to an Orange man out of desperation because of the incumbent head of state's outstandingly poor political leadership. Who could picture such a thing? Now, support for the Orange Man was, of course, accompanied by the inevitable storming of the capital. William, he was able to make it to London less than a month after his landing in the southwest of England. In Scotland, the most sizable event of the Williamite intervention in British and Irish politics occurred in December 1688 with the anti-Catholic riots of Edinburgh. The Edinburgh riots occurred on the very same day that King James first attempted to flee from England to France. Now, James, he was caught and placed under house arrest, but subsequently would escape his imprisonment more easily than the virus making its way out of a Wuhan lab. The English parliamentarians, they would deem that James's flight to France was a voluntary abdication of his throne and then offer his English crown to his daughter and son-in-law. William and Mary were offered the English throne in February 1689. In Scotland, a convention was called, and this convention agreed that King James had broken his contract with the Scottish subjects and, as such, had vacated his Scottish throne. And so in May 1689, William and Mary were offered the Scottish throne as well. As unthinkable as it may be to a modern contemporary audience, the entirety of the British Isles was now under the control of a foreign royal family and not a patriotically German royal family as we currently have today. And you'd think, wouldn't you, that a family coming over on a boat, sponging off of the British state for hundreds and hundreds of years, that Reform voters would not like the royal family, but apparently these are the correct types of immigrants. Now, if this is the first time that you have listened to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast, then this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's Scottish history with lots of Farage bashing and jokes about the royal family. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, perhaps you should consult your local Orange Lodge for a well-balanced, non-biased history of the Williamite Revolution. So, without further ado, folks, here is your first episode of the brand new series of the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast, all about the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689. I do hope you enjoy it, have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! William set sail from the Netherlands with an armada of around 60 ships and 14,000 men on the 19th of October 1688. Storms would halt the invasion's initial progress, forcing William's fleet back into harbour, but eventually on the 5th of November 1688, William landed at Torbay in the English West Country, and the so-called Glorious Revolution had begun in earnest. Now, the Glorious Revolution, it has its roots very firmly in England, and that's because Scotland in late 1688 remained a country a far distance from any kind of national rebellion. But that's not to say that the Scots did not play an important role in the Williamite invasion of Britain. Accompanying William was a group of Covenanters who had been exiled to the Netherlands during the Restoration period and the Killing Time. These men made up a Scottish brigade within William's landing force and were commanded by the experienced Scottish Highland commander, Captain Hugh Mackay of Scorey. And among them were some very influential men and important people who would go on to fulfill important roles within the Williamite regime. Around a quarter of those who would make up the Scottish Parliament of the early 18th century were Scots who had spent time in the Netherlands before the 1688 invasion. After a quick meal at the Torbay Carvery, William moved quickly across England trying to make his way to London. King James, he had amassed a sizable army of 25,000 at Salisbury to halt William's progress. But James, he constantly questioned the loyalty of his own army. Apparently, he had one of his regiments paraded in front of him and instructed his troops to either voice their approval of his policies or lay down their arms. Subsequently, all but two of James's officers laid down their arms. James's army was comprised of supporters of questionable loyalty ready to switch their allegiance at a moment's notice if they sensed for a second that they were not going to win. His army was comprised mostly of Manchester City supporters. On the other hand, the Orange Guy supporters were fiercely loyal to the extent that their leader could be charged with tax evasion, falsifying records, election interference, racketeering, paying hush money to a porn star, sexual assault, and still they would be there right by his side, ready to storm the capital at a moment's notice. A notable defection from King James's army was that of General John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, who would go on to play a key role in the reign of Queen Anne in the early 18th century. James's top guy had defected to the other side like a Reform MP. But it was Marlborough's wife, Sarah, who was close friends with James's youngest daughter, Princess Anne, the future Queen Anne. And Sarah, she was able to convince Princess Anne to leave London and declare for a free Protestant Parliament in Nottingham in November 1688. And it was Anne's defection that was the most crushing of all for the king. The king's youngest child had abandoned him to make off with a celebrity spouse and write an autobiography denouncing the entire family. It must have been absolutely devastating for the king. The celebrity spouse in question here was Prince George of Denmark, Princess Anne's husband. Before William's invasion in 1688, the Protestant opposition to King James's Catholic rule in England was centred not around the foreign William of Orange, the so-called protector of Protestantism in Europe. It was focused instead on Princess Anne and Prince George at Whitehall Palace in London. The Protestant opposition would become known as the Cockpit on account of the fact that the Protestant dissenters would meet at the Royal Cock Theatre at Whitehall, which, I know that Donald Trump loves putting his name to buildings. I think that one would be perfect for him. Princess Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark, had been a high-profile member of James's Privy Council, and this was a position that caused tension between William of Orange and George. George's marriage to Anne was deemed to be a diplomatic coup by Denmark as Denmark opposed Dutch expansion in Europe. Prince George's marriage to Anne, it shored up English support against the Dutch, and it royally pissed off William, who was unhappy with his brother-in-law's high position and standing in the English royal court. In reality, George, he had little influence on the Privy Council. He was nothing like the political powerhouse that William was or aspired to be. George, he just wanted a quiet life. He had little interest in diplomatic politics. He was, however, a staunch Protestant, and Prince George was key in ensuring that his wife, Princess Anne, did not convert to Catholicism at the behest of her Catholic father. By mid-1688, George, he had become aware of William's invasion plans, and seeing the inevitability of his success, he withdrew from James's royal court, and in October 1688, he refused to take a position of command in James's army at Salisbury. It was yet another high-profile defection for James. By November 1688, both of his daughters and his son-in-laws were in open rebellion against him. It was a family dynamic about as fucked up as the Westboro Baptist Church, and it must have made Christmas dinner round James's house awkward as hell. All of the defections and desertions meant that James's army at Salisbury stood little chance of resisting William's advance towards London. It wasn't all bad news for James. He did have support in Scotland. John Claverhouse, raised to Viscount Dundee in October 1688, on learning of the Williamite invasion of England, marched south with a 357-strong regiment to try and block William's advance into London. But by the time Dundee had reached London, the cause was already lost. James had disbanded his army at Salisbury and fled for France, leaving Dundee's Scottish troops stranded outside of London and unsure of what move to make next. It was like flying into London Stansted Airport. Dundee's removal of troops from Scotland had also left the royalist government in Scotland vulnerable to attack, and it created an opportunity for the most committed Presbyterians in the Covenanting heartlands of the southwest of Scotland, along with supporters of William's in Edinburgh, mostly students from the University of Edinburgh, to make a move against the government in Scotland. On the 9th of December 1688, the very same day that King James made his first attempt to try and flee to France, the most sizable event in Scotland in the Williamite invasions took place, the anti-Catholic riots of Edinburgh. The students of the University of Edinburgh rioted after learning the news that a student from a Scottish working-class background had been mistakenly enrolled into the university. And normally, anti-Catholic demonstrations in Scotland, they take place in July, and usually when students of the University of Edinburgh get together in the city, it's in August to put on plays about their feelings. But this anti-Catholic riot, often referred to as the Holyrood Riot, it broke out after Claverhouse had marched his Scottish army south in support of King James. It left the city virtually unguarded. The Lord Provost locked the city gates and posted guards at Holyrood, while the castle governor, George Gordon, the Duke of Gordon, locked the gates of the castle and took cover. But there was little that they could do to stop the throngs of rioting students and Covenanters from destroying the city. The rioters, they made their way down the Royal Mile, and as they did so, they burned effigies of the Pope, and they took down the heads of the Covenanting martyrs displayed on pikes above the city gates. When they reached Holyrood at the bottom of the Canongate, guards opened fire and killed 12 students. Now, obviously, for my American listeners, 12 students being killed in a shooting is barely considered news. But in Scotland in the 17th century, this was considered outrageous, and the incensed crowd overwhelmed the guards at Holyrood and ransacked the abbey. They destroyed the Jesuit school, the recently renovated Chapel Royal, and the abbey's printing press. The rioters destroyed records which had been kept at the abbey since the 12th century, as well as gold and silver, vessels and artefacts. Worst of all, they broke into the tombs of the Royal Stuarts and looted and desecrated their graves. They were more disrespectful to dead royals than your average Celtic supporter after the Queen's death. The rioters, they were able to carry out more damage on an ancient building in Scotland than your average grand designs project. And Holyrood Abbey remains in a state of disrepair to this day, thanks to the actions of the Edinburgh rioters of December 1688. While riots were occurring in Edinburgh, in the Covenanting strongholds of the southwest of Scotland, the Cameronians took the opportunity, with the area stripped of its military presence, to settle some old grievances with the Restoration regime. Scores of the King's curates. If you remember from previous episodes, these were the placemen who had been parachuted into parishes to replace Presbyterian ministers who had refused to take an oath of allegiance to King Charles and then to King James and to denounce the National Covenant during the Restoration period in Scotland. These King's curates were rabbled from their ministerial homes. Many were violently beaten and killed. Over 200 Episcopal ministers were rabble-dabble-dooed and forcibly ejected from their homes by roving bands of Cameronians. Although it should be noted that the Cameronians unlike the rioting students in Edinburgh, were not acting in the name of King William. Many, if not most of the Cameronians were not convinced Williamites, certainly not at this stage. They were just as wary of King William as they were King James. Just because you are a devout Presbyterian does not mean that you have to love King William. Please, for the love of God, do not mention this to any Rangers supporting people who happen to be in your lives. I doubt that their wee hearts could take it. As mentioned earlier, the Covenanters' old adversary, John Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, had been unable to make it to London in time to be of any assistance to King James. But he was able to escape back into Scotland with around 30 of his most loyal horsemen. But the rest of his army, it was swallowed up and incorporated into the Williamite army in Scotland and placed under the command of Captain Hugh Mackay. While William took control in London, James attempted to make it to France, where he would join his queen, Mary of Modena, and their son and heir, James, both of whom had been successfully smuggled out of the country. But James, he was caught en route to France by Kentish fishermen. He was detained for 3 days in Faversham in Kent before then being brought back to London, where he was placed under house arrest at his home at St James Palace in London. William, he had been able to take control of the capital with minimal effort, purely because his predecessor was entirely useless and the general public had abandoned his cause and grown sick of the ruling party in Westminster. William was the kind of Keir Starmer of his time. James's presence in London, it wasn't a threat to William, but it certainly was an embarrassment. James was William's father-in-law, and as such, any violence carried out against him could rally support for King James and create a backlash against this new foreign regime. So William, he attempted to coerce his father-in-law into escaping the country under his own volition. James was ordered out of the city to Rochester in Kent, where passage to France could easily be secured. James took the hint, and on the 23rd of December 1688, he made it for France on a frigate. It was the most straightforward escape in British history. James arrived in Ambleteau in France on Christmas Day. As he sailed, he is said to have tossed the seal of the realm of England into the River Thames, which, I don't know why he did that, because, seals, they famously love the water. James may have fled to France, but he was still the legal king of Scotland, England, and Ireland, but his reign was very much over. Legally, James may well have still been in charge, but everyone knew that actually someone else was running the country now in his place. James and William, they had that kind of like Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings dynamic going on. In England, the transition of power from the Stuart to the Williamite regime was carried out with almost astonishing blandness. As far as the English parliamentarians were concerned, by fleeing the country, King James had absconded and legally abdicated his throne. William, for his part, he had not invaded Britain. Instead, he had just arrived with a personal bodyguard of 14,000 men. He was like Tommy Robinson. But William's English intervention was quite clearly an invasion, and James had quite clearly not voluntarily abdicated his throne. And even if, for argument's sake, King James had voluntarily abdicated his throne, then his male heir would, through birthright, legally ascend to the throne in his place. But the English parliamentarians, they didn't really care about James as his male heir. It's like how Bono's kid is in a band. No one really gives a fuck. In their eyes, there was a legal heir and there was an appropriate heir. And the most suitable person for the throne was James's Protestant daughter, Mary. But Mary, she was only willing to rule if she could do so alongside her husband William of Orange, who was himself unwilling to accept the position of king consort. I'll only accept the crown if my husband can be monarch alongside me. William and Mary were like the Beyonce and Jay-Z of the 17th century. So, in order to facilitate the ascension of King William and Queen Mary to the English throne, and for their rule to be considered legitimate and legal, a constitutional settlement was required. On the 22nd of January 1689, a convention was called at Westminster. A convention is basically a meeting of MPs that's not being called by the monarch. And at the Westminster Convention, it was declared that King James II had broken the contract between the monarch and their people, and as such had voluntarily abdicated his throne. The convention issued a Declaration of Rights, and this was the basis of the offer on which the English crown was made to William and Mary. The Declaration of Rights stressed the primacy of Parliament and government. It stated that no laws could be suspended or taxes levied by the monarch without the consent of the Parliament. The king is not above the law, basically. Although the king's brother, he can do whatever the fuck he wants. Most importantly, the Declaration of Rights stated that no monarch or spouse of a monarch could be Roman Catholic, which of course excluded James and his male heir from the English line. These days, of course, no one is concerned about the monarch's religion. As long as you didn't go to private school and aren't laughably corrupt, then you too can become head of state. I am, of course, joking. You need to be both of those things, and you're still not allowed to be Catholic to be head of state of Great Britain. William and Mary accepted the terms of the Declaration of Rights, and on the 13th of February 1689, they were proclaimed joint sovereigns of England and Ireland. The situation in Scotland was more confused than it was in England. A party of 30 peers and 80 gentlemen of Scotland were sent to London in January 1689 to formally invite William and Mary to take temporary control of affairs in Scotland. A convention of the estates was then called in Edinburgh in March 1689. This was a meeting of the prelates, nobles and commissioners of the royal boroughs. And this convention of the estates had a fairly straightforward decision to take. Should Scotland continue with King James VII as its head of state and king, or should Scotland follow England's example and make William and Mary joint monarchs? The convention, it was split into those who supported William, who'd become known as Whigs, and those who supported James, who'd become known as Jacobites. But in truth, however, the presence of armed Cameronians on the streets of Edinburgh meant that there were very few supporters of James present at the convention or in the city at all. Edinburgh was a danger spot for Jacobites. The city was filled with armed Cameronians eager to carry out a godly murder against their Episcopalian opponents. The people of Edinburgh were terrified that everybody in the west of Scotland desperately wanted to murder them all. And this is a concern that residents of the city share to this day with their 17th century compatriots. And so the convention that met in Edinburgh in March 1689 was dominated by Whigs. But even still, the Cameronians, they remained undecided about William and Mary. And on the 3rd of March 1689, they held their own assembly at Lesmahago, at which they opted not to endorse William and Mary to become joint monarchs of Scotland. On the 14th of March, the Convention of Estates met in Edinburgh. William Douglas, the Duke of Hamilton, was appointed William's commissioner to the convention and was duly elected its president, thanks in no part to the fact that the convention was being guarded by armed Cameronians. The convention's first point of business was to consider two letters, one from William and one from James. William's letter was courteous and conciliatory. It spoke of securing the Protestant religion, protecting the laws and liberties of Scotland, and it expressed hope for a union with England. James's letter, on the other hand, was hastily written while en route to Ireland. It was rambling, angry, and full of vague threats with no mentions of Scotland's religion. As the contemporary periodical put it, instead of encouraging King James's friends, it put them out of countenance. One person communicated clearly and empathetically, the other rambled and threatened incoherently. Obviously, these days, if we were going to choose someone to be leader of the country, we would go for the rambling, threatening, incoherent one. The letter, it would prove to be James's downfall. And I mean, it wasn't even that bad when you think about it. I mean, it's not like, he sketched a drawing of a naked lady and sent it to a paedophile billionaire. On the 4th of April 1689, the convention decided in near unanimity, there was only 5 dissenting votes, that James had forfeited the crown and as such the throne of Scotland was now vacant. And unlike their English counterparts, the convention made no mention of abdication, putting paid to the suggestion that James had voluntarily given up his throne. The convention instead deemed that James had broken his contract with the subjects, and they accused the king of trying to convert a limited monarchy into one of despotic authority. James, he had violated the laws and liberties of Scotland, according to the convention, altered the religion of the country, and as such had forfeited his crown. The convention thereafter decided to offer the crown of Scotland to the Prince and Princess of Orange, now King and Queen of England. On the 11th of April 1689, William II and Mary II of Scotland were proclaimed joint monarchs of the country at the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh. It was also decided that if William and Mary did not produce heirs, then the crown of Scotland would pass to Mary's sister Anne, thus cutting James's male heir out of the Scottish succession entirely. Two documents were drawn up that would set out the constitutional principles of Scotland. These documents were called the Claim of Right and the Articles of Grievance. These constitutional documents stated that no Catholic could be King or Queen of Scotland, nor any officer of state, nor could any monarch of Scotland be married to a Roman Catholic. The monarch could not use royal prerogative to override the laws of the land. Parliament must meet regularly and debate freely. No taxes could be raised by the monarch without the consent of the Parliament. And the convention recommended that prelacy be abolished in Scotland and replaced by the Presbyterian ecclesiastical system. Bishops were expelled from the Parliament, and no army could be raised by the monarch without the Parliament's consent. The Lords of the Articles, the royal committee that was so easily controlled by monarchs during the Restoration period in Scotland, it was abolished. The convention had created a revolution settlement in Scotland that saw a massive shift in the balance of political power from the king to the Parliament. 3 Scottish commissioners, Archibald Campbell, the Duke of Argyll, Sir James Montgomery of Shelmorley, and Sir John Dalrymple of Stair, were sent to London to offer the Scottish crown to William and Mary on the terms laid out in the Claim of Right and Articles of Grievance. 3 commissioners were sent to London to ask the people there to run our country for us. And these men were, of course, the founding members of the Scottish Conservative Party. It's not certain whether William and Mary agreed fully to the conditions laid out by the Scottish Commissioners, and this confusion over whether they fully accepted the constitutional terms of the Scottish Convention would lead to tension between the monarch and the Scottish parliamentarians throughout William and Mary's reign in Scotland. The monarchs were able to retain the key levers of power in Scotland, which was the right to appoint officers of state and the Lords of Session, which is the key positions within the judiciary. Nonetheless, on the 11th of May 1689, William and Mary accepted the Scottish crown, and the Scottish Commissioners administered the coronation oath to the new Scottish monarchs in London. There was no Scottish coronation, and at no point throughout their reign would either William or Mary visit their northern kingdom. William and Mary were now head of state for a country they cared little about and didn't even bother visiting. I mean, honest to God, even Trump sent J.D. Vance over to Greenland before he was considering invading the fucking place. The revolution settlement in Scotland would take 19 months to become reality, and there would be no resolution of the church settlement until June 1690. William, he was hesitant about the reintroduction of Presbyterianism in Scotland, and he wanted to stick to an episcopal system because, as king, he had more control over it. But when it became clear that the Scottish episcopal bishops were never going to accept William as their king, they were fiercely loyal to King James, his hand was forced. But this is something that we're going to cover in upcoming episodes. Stay tuned for episodes on ecclesiastical restructuring in Scotland. I hope the anticipation doesn't kill you. The revolution settlement in Scotland lacked the moderation of the English revolution settlement because there was no opposition present at the Scottish Convention. There was no opposition to the Whigs at the Scottish Convention because of the armed, hardline Presbyterian Cameronians who were guarding the doors of the convention. They intimidated the Jacobites to the point that they just simply didn't attend. The English settlement, it had a more conciliatory tone because it was presented to a mostly Tory parliament. But Scotland's revolution settlement was far more Whiggish in nature, and this is despite the fact that the Whigs were by far and away a more marked minority in Scotland than they were in England. The revolution settlement in Scotland, it took place in the face of a potential Catholic invasion from Ireland and in the midst of what had transpired in England at the end of 1688. It was a mix of kind of Scottish constitutional theory, a reworking of the constitution Charles I had agreed to in 1647, as well as English constitutional principles that had been laid out in the Declaration of Rights. It was also, however, a work of extreme covenanting practice, and that's because it had to appease the armed Cameronians guarding the doors of the convention and whose favour was required to ensure the convention's safety. This meant that Scotland's constitutional settlement of 1689 was a contradiction of terms. It was simultaneously forward-thinking while also being backwards. It was like HS2. The constitutional settlement in Scotland, it was born out of a political and military crisis, and as such, it would lead to a profoundly unstable government in Scotland throughout the 1690s. What is striking is just how little support James had from the Scots nobility in Scotland. The Jacobite movement in its early stages had a stark lack of support from the Scots nobility. The bulk of the Jacobite support lay north of the River Tay, particularly amongst the Highland chieftains, whose supposed greatest concern was the inevitable Argyll-Campbell resurgence that would accompany Williamite rule in Scotland. Now, this is a well-worn position that's been argued by many Jacobite historians over the years, but on the next episode of the podcast, we'll talk about how this wasn't necessarily where the motivations of the Highland chieftains actually lay. Now, everything wasn't completely hopeless for King James in Scotland. He still had Claverhouse, and Edinburgh Castle was being held in his name by the loyal Duke of Gordon. And when John Claverhouse first raised the Jacobite standard on Dundee Law in April 1689, marking the beginnings of the first Jacobite Rising in Scotland, this was not a forlorn romantic gesture in the face of near impossible odds, something akin to the Great Montrose in his Year of Miracles. Dundee's Jacobite Rising, it definitely stood a chance. James at this time was carrying out an alarmingly successful campaign in Ireland, alarming at least from the perspective of the covenanting Whig convention that was being held in Scotland at that time. And Dundee, he was confident that the exiled King James would be able to win in Ireland and send Irish Catholic royalist reinforcements to support his Jacobite rising in Scotland. James travelled from France to Ireland in March 1689. His plan was to then move from Ireland onto Scotland, like your average American tourist. And by the time that James had arrived in Ireland, fighting it had already broken out between the Royalist forces and Protestant militias. Yet another example of how the Williamite Revolution was anything but glorious or bloodless in Ireland and Scotland. The Whiggish convention in Scotland at this time kept a close eye on their embattled Presbyterian counterparts as James and his Lord Lieutenant Richard Talbot turned their attention to the north of Ireland and tried to take the town of Derry from its Protestant defenders. The defenders of the city famously repelled the Jacobite besiegers after the apprentices of the town locked the gates and informed the Jacobites that no tools were kept in the town overnight. The Protestant defenders successfully repelled the besiegers for over 100 days before finally being relieved by Williamite forces in August 1689. Claverhouse, he never received the Irish reinforcements that he had hoped for, at least not in the numbers that he expected. And yet still, with a small force of just a few thousand men, mostly Highland clansmen, he was able to pull off a spectacular and famous Jacobite victory at the Battle of Killiecrankie in July 1689. And it is the Battle of Killiecrankie and the first of the Jacobite risings in Scotland that we are going to talk about on the next episode of the podcast. So that brings us to the end of the episode, folks. I do hope that you enjoyed it. We have some episodes coming up about some really famous moments in Scottish history. The Battle of Killiecrankie, the Massacre of Glencoe, the Darien Expedition. Today's episode was perhaps a wee bit paperwork heavy. Lots of stuff about the nuances of revolution settlements, but absolutely necessary in setting the scene as to how these big set-piece moments in Scottish history come about later down the line. Thank you so much for your patience in waiting so long for these episodes to come out. I release 6 episodes of the podcast at this time of year each year. And that's because each episode of the podcast is essentially a 5,500 word script that I research and write myself. If you appreciate the effort that goes into me doing that, you can leave me the price of a cup of coffee or a pint of beer at my Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-fi accounts. I'm on both of those at Mountebank, Scotland. It's massively, massively appreciated. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank, Scotland. I'm usually on there posting videos about Scottish history, stand-up clips, all that sort of stuff. Please like, rate, share the podcast. It all helps massively with the algorithm. And those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast, you'll know that at the end of each episode, I like to match what I'm talking about in the episode with a whisky from Scotland. And I'm going to match the events of the Glorious Revolution with Scallywag whisky, because, you know, William, he really was quite the scallywag, wasn't he? Scallywag is a premium blended whisky from Speyside. It celebrates three of the big hitters. You've got Macallan in there, you've got Mortlach, and you've got Glenrothes. It's a really, really cracking whisky. And the reason why I'm matching it with the events of today's podcast is because a couple of years ago, they did a whisky that was finished in orange wine casks from Spain. It was super zesty, really, really fragrant and interesting. I actually just repurchased the whisky a couple of weeks ago. So check out Scallywag. It's an absolute cracker. I think that's everything I need to tell you. Thank you all so, so much for listening, and I'll see you all in the next episode of the podcast. Cheerio then. Bye-bye.